Chapter 10. South Africa. In the autumn of 1896, the earliest practicable time after the raid and its immediate sequelae, Chamberlain intended to go out to South Africa himself and meet President Kruger in person. The personal interview, which had been attempted on the morrow of the raid by inviting Kruger to London and which had proved abortive because of Kruger's preconditions, was to be secured by Mahomet going to the mountain. Instead, Chamberlain's destination was changed to Washington by the exigencies of a dispute between the United States over the boundaries of Venezuela and British Guiana. Meanwhile, in breach of the Convention of 1884, the Transvaal imposed serious new restrictions upon resident aliens and took powers of arbitrary expulsion against them. Only when modest reinforcements were on their way to South Africa in May 1897 did Chamberlain secure compliance with her demand that the offending legislation be repealed. Throughout the next 2.5 years, the Transvaal rapidly increased its armaments, and the new High Commissioner, Sir Alfred Milner, arrived at the conviction that, from a purely South African point of view, I should be inclined to work up to a crisis. It means that we shall have to fight, and to fight more or less at a moment chosen by the other side, who may very likely not realize what they are doing. Words written immediately after Kruger had secured a crushing re-election as president and had constituted himself virtually an autocrat. On the other hand, Chamberlain, seeing South Africa in the context of the worldwide power politics of European nations, adhered to his initial position that we have no reason, either of right or interest, which would justify a war in South Africa. I do not believe that there will be a war. Our business is to bring about a fair settlement. At the beginning of 1898, Britain, in her traditional unalignment, was vulnerable, in the event of a major entanglement in South Africa, both to Germany and to France, and both in Europe and in Africa. In a speech of unministerial candour in May 1898, long famous from a proverbial expression which it contained, as the long spoon speech, Chamberlain tried to bring this situation home to the public. We are liable to be confronted at any moment with a combination of great powers. We stand alone. It is a situation which Salisbury as Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, and Chamberlain as Colonial Secretary, succeeded during the 18 months in transforming into one which at least ensured freedom of action for Britain in Southern Africa. The sequence of events is impressive. In June 1898, a convention was concluded with France, which ended a period of dangerous friction and overlap between the two countries in the Niger Basin. In August, a treaty with Germany, the terms of which were unpublished, secured exclusive British influence in Delagoa Bay, whence the railway ran from Lourenço Marques to the Transvaal, in return for an agreement on the partitioning of Portuguese colonial empire in the hypothetical event of its demise. A few days later, the Battle of Omdurman terminated Kitchener's slow but sure reconquest of Sudan. But the Sudan as a whole and Britain's control over the entire Nile Valley and the Cape to Cairo route were not secure until, after months of critical tension, the Anglo-French Convention of March 1899 established the watershed between the Nile and Congo basins as the boundary between the French and British spheres. The rest of 1899 was devoted to a torturous negotiation for purchase, by colonial concessions, of the declared neutrality of Germany in the Transvaal. The article was eventually secured at the price of Samoa, and packaged and delivered by the state visit of the Kaiser to Britain in November 1899. It was only just in time, for by then war with South African republics had begun. It did not matter that a new treaty with Portugal, which secured its benevolent neutrality in return for a territorial guarantee of the Portuguese colonies, did not come until 1900. The mere catalogue of these events gives some impression, though partial and imperfect, of the intensity of the worldwide colonial scramble at the close of the 19th century, which was the environment of Chamberlain's years as Colonial Secretary. It would tax Thucydides to trace the interlocking causes which during 1899 made war at last seem inevitable to Britain and the Transvaal. The pressures upon the Uitlanders undoubtedly increased during the summer of 1898-99, and resulted in a direct and reasoned petition from them in March to April to the Queen, as sovereign of the great majority of them and suzerain of the Transvaal. Obliged to react, the cabinet at Milner's own suggestion proposed a conference between Kruger and Milner, which took place at Bloemfontein in the Orange Free State. It ended on the 5th of May in fiasco, for which both personalities were equally responsible. Chamberlain was evidently dismayed by the break. "You should be very patient," he wired, too late, to Milner, "and admit a good deal of haggling before you finally abandon the game." Nevertheless, he accepted the consequences and both published a lurid dispatch, the Helot dispatch, from Milner, and addressed himself in his customary decisive fashion to public opinion in a speech in the Birmingham Town Hall in June, which contained the phrases, long to echo, in Birmingham memories especially, warning the Transvaal that the government, having put their hands to the plough, will see it through. The warning appeared to work. In July, a franchise bill was introduced into the Transvaal legislature, which, however guardedly, contained the principle of enfranchisement of the Uitlanders and their representation in the Volksraad. Chamberlain's relief and delight were unmistakable. "No one would dream," he cabled Milner on 18th of July, "of fighting over 2 years in qualification period for the franchise. We ought to make the most of this and accept it as a basis for settlement." Why then, when the Transvaal of its own accord had apparently gone so far, did everything turn sour so suddenly? By 24th of August, Chamberlain was writing, "It is clear that we cannot go on negotiating forever. We must try to bring matters to a head. The next step in military preparations is so important and so costly that I hesitate to incur the expense, so long as there seems a fair chance of a satisfactory settlement. But I dread above all the continuing whittling away of our differences until we have no casus belli left." 2 days after this, in another Birmingham speech in the grounds of his own house at Highbury, another memorable and more menacing phrase was used. "The issues of peace and war are in the hands of President Kruger and his advisers. Will he speak the necessary words? The sands are running down in the glass. The situation is too fraught with danger. It is too strained for any indefinite postponement to be tolerated." The answer appears to be that British attempts to ensure the solidity of the Transvaal reforms by submitting them to a joint inquiry, with a subsequent conference between Milner and Kruger and an Anglo-Boer tribunal of arbitration, convinced Kruger that his legislation was simply to be used as an instrument for taking over the country step by step. The continuing armament of the Transvaal, the anxiety of the Uitlanders, and the reinforcement, however small and tardy, of British troops in the Natal and the Cape, all added to the mutual misconception and antagonism. Above all, perhaps, the convictions of Milner had done their work at last. As Salisbury wrote to the Secretary of State for War, Lord Lansdowne, on the 30th of August, 1899, "What Milner has done cannot be effaced. We have to work up upon a morale field prepared for us by him and his jingo supporters." While Britain worked up by the end of September towards her own ultimatum, it was anticipated by a brusque demand from Kruger, delivered on 9th of October, insisting that British troops be withdrawn from the Transvaal borders, that the recent reinforcements be removed from South Africa, and that those on the high seas be diverted. Upon its rejection, the two republics declared war on Britain and invaded Natal and Bechuanaland. Upon the whole, Chamberlain told truth, though less than entire truth, when he declared on 19th October to the reassembled House of Commons that "from the first day I came into office I hoped for peace, I strove for peace. At that time, and down to the most recent period, I have believed in peace. All the same, throughout most of the world, it was Chamberlain's war." Like other wars, before and after, this one was to be over by Christmas. But the opening weeks were weeks of disaster, militarily and for Chamberlain personally. During the Kaiser's visit, he had had conversations with the Foreign Minister, von Bülow, as well as His Imperial Majesty, and from these he gained the impression that a ballon d'essai would be welcomed and reciprocated by Germany, so helping to bring Britain out of her isolation into the preferred alliance. On the 30th of November, the day after the Kaiser's departure, with remarkable gaucherie and innocence, he accordingly informed an audience at Leicester, and throughout the world, that the natural alliance is between ourselves and the great German Empire, and went on to imagine Britain as linking the United States on one hand, and Germany on the other, in an understanding which might do more perhaps than any combinations of arms in order to preserve the peace of the world. This imperial gaffe was greeted in Germany and elsewhere with coldness, ridicule, or hostility. Any less important figure in government could scarcely have survived it, and it disclosed unforgettably a provincialism and incomprehension of the continental scene, above all the German scene, which, by a historic irony, his younger son Neville was fated to exemplify on a grandiose scale. While Chamberlain floundered in the aftermath of this indiscretion, there befell, perhaps fortunately for him, a series of military disasters in a single black week. 11 to 15 December, which humiliated British arms and left Kimberley, Mafeking and Ladysmith hopelessly invested. In the incredibly short space of 2 months, this scene was transformed. Forces which amounted eventually to 180,000 men were raised and dispatched to South Africa. Lord Roberts and Kitchener took over command from the discredited generals, and above all the self-governing colonies, hitherto somewhat cool in their declared support, vied with one another in sending contingents, an impulse which deeply impressed themselves, the mother country and Chamberlain. In triumphantly winding up the government for the inevitable censure debate on the 5th of February 1900, he told the House that there were trustees not merely of a kingdom, but of a federation. We are advancing steadily, if slowly, to the realization of that great federation of our race which will inevitably make peace and liberty and justice. He was even moved in March to address confidentially to the colonial governments an inquiry whether they considered that defence of the empire and its military and naval resources have so far become the common concern of the whole empire, that joint action, or at least joint consideration, with regards to his subjects should be organised on a permanent footing. He went on to adumbrate an imperial council with salaried members provided by the empire in proportion to population, who might be life peers or privy councillors. As 3 years before, the reaction was negative. The arrangement of tariff questions, replied Sir Wilfrid Laurier of Canada, would be far more likely to bring about imperial unity than any joint system of imperial defence. When in the same month the representations of Australian colonies arrived with the bill which would federate them unto a commonwealth, the one point in which Chamberlain stuck and eventually secured a compromise was the limitation of the existing right of judicial appeal to the Privy Council. Once again, imperial unity by another route was in his mind. The Lord Chancellor, he told the Commons on the 14th of May, has had in mind an amalgamation of the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council with the appeal jurisdiction of the House of Lords with a view to creating a Supreme Court of the Empire. Meanwhile, starting to a bare 2 months after the Black Week, Lord Roberts carried the flag to Pretoria in an advance which culminated in the relief of Mafeking on the 17th of May and Ladysmith on the 28th of May, and the entry on the 5th of June into the capital of the Transvaal, whence President Kruger fled to Mozambique and thence to Holland. Before then, Chamberlain had announced in a speech in the Birmingham Town Hall the intention, as soon as it is safe and possible, to introduce these states, the Orange and the Transvaal, into the great circle of self-governing colonies. Only thus would a federated South Africa, with a federated Canada and a federated Australia, be sufficient to sustain what, in the same speech, Chamberlain called the unity of this great federation of sister nations that we call the British Empire. To carry forward the impetus, in South Africa and throughout the Empire, Chamberlain ardently desired the space of time which only a new Parliament could furnish. He had his wish in the khaki election, declared on 17th of September 1900, in which he made a dozen speeches in 3 weeks, with day intervals between, all in the West Midlands except for Foray to Oldham to support, successfully Lord Randolph Churchill's son, Winston. The new Parliament gave the government the same massive base as the old had done in 1895, a majority of 134 now, compared with 129 then. Again, even more than in 1895, Chamberlain could have moved in the reshuffle to any office of his choice. Even more pertinently, he made the almost quixotic decision to continue as Colonial Secretary. The election had taken place in the nick of time. It was scarcely won before the war was seen not yet to be over. Defeated in regular warfare, the Boers, under a group of brilliant guerrilla leaders, exploited their own characteristics and those of their country, together with the classic difficulties of a power which had annexed and was setting out to administer a predominantly alien population. For 18 months it was necessary to wear down Boer resistance by a laborious process of intersecting the country with lines of blockhouses and barbed wire, destroying farms and removing the women and children to camps where initially the mortality from decease was appalling. The worldwide, as well as the British, dismay and criticism aroused by this campaign provided the background to the episode from which emerged the conclusion that Britain's alignment was not to be with Germany but with France. Queen Victoria died quite unexpectedly in January 1901, and Chamberlain seized the opportunity to urge upon King Edward a new style appropriate to his vision of a great federation of sister nations. The original idea was King of Greater Britain beyond the seas. But under Canadian influence, this was modified to the form King of all the British dominions beyond the seas, which survived until 1952. Queen Victoria's death, however, had not been so sudden that her grandson, the Kaiser, did not reach England before she died and join in the national grief. It so happened that immediately before this, Chamberlain and the Duke of Devonshire had thrown out feelers to the German ambassador in the direction of a rapprochement with Germany. There followed an almost exact repetition of the tragicomedy of 1899, after which the rebuffs administered by Germany and the ill feeling engendered in the news from South Africa built up to an explosive atmosphere throughout 1901. As usual, the detonator was a Chamberlain speech. Rebutting foreign references to British cruelty and barbarity in a meeting at Edinburgh on the 25th of October, Chamberlain sharply turned the tables upon the critics. The storm of disproportionate protest with which his words were greeted in Germany, and which continued for months, revealed at last to public opinion the depth of the contempt as well as the hatred in which Germany held Britain. Thenceforward, Chamberlain was the unremitting partisan of détente with Russia and entente cordiale with France. The Boers under arms finally conceded defeat at Vereeniging on the 31st of May, 1902, and accepted British sovereignty in return for the famous financial terms to rebuild their country, full equality for the Dutch language, mild treatment of the rebellion in the Cape and Natal, and the promise of early self-government. Almost immediately, Milner proposed to Chamberlain that he should visit South Africa. In October 1902, the cabinet approved the visit, and on 25th of November, with Mrs. Chamberlain, he sailed from Portsmouth on the maiden voyage of the cruiser HMS Good Hope. In Egypt, he renewed his convictions of the indispensability and beneficence of undivided British rule. In East Africa, he was overwhelmed by the impressions of undeveloped states as he penetrated from Mombasa into Kenya. In South Africa itself, he travelled from Natal into the Transvaal, and thence through the Orange River colony to the Cape. Everywhere, in gatherings small or large, official or informal, he sought by every means to emphasize the acceptance and equality of the Boers, while still insisting on the permanence of the terms of the victory and the response and cooperation which Britons felt entitled to expect from their new fellow subjects. My object is to secure in this colony the fusion of races, to make two peoples into one. Good citizenship should be the test of everything in South Africa. Before leaving Cape Town on the 25th of February 1903, he received from the leaders of the Dutch party, the Bond, what he described as assurances so full, so definite, so authoritative, that I cannot doubt that their publication will have its effect. And from the English Progressive Party, an unsolicited and handsome acceptance of that assurance. His parting injunction was to make preparation for that ultimate federation of South Africa, which is destined, I hope in the near future, to establish a new nation under the British flag. On the 14th of March, he landed at Southampton after 4 months' absence, to a triumphant welcome and a wintry political scene. Chapter 11. Tariff Reform. In the detachment of absence, Chamberlain revolved, with little satisfaction, the political events of the previous 12 months. On the 24th of March 1902, the government, he not dissenting however reluctant, had introduced an education bill in the full consciousness and expectation that it would be their death warrant. It was forced upon them by the necessity of legislation to eliminate the overlap which had arisen in secondary education between the school boards and the county councils, something which it was impossible to do while leaving compulsory elementary education untouched. They were thus obliged to reopen the settlement of the 1870s as between the board and the voluntary schools. Their decision was to unify under the county councils the whole oversight of primary and post-primary education, thus making them responsible for the standards and therefore for the maintenance, mainly out of rates, of the religious schools. The bill, which reached the statute book unmodified in principle in December 1902, ran counter to the nonconformist principles, not to say passions, on education which had brought Chamberlain into politics at the beginning. He was now on the other side. A whole section of liberalism would be lost to unionism. Almost immediately afterwards, the government took another step, seen as even more suicidal electorally. In the budget of the 14th of April, the Chancellor Hick's speech imposed a revenue duty, known as the shilling duty, on imported corn, in order to meet a budget deficit without unduly increasing the income and other taxes. Such a duty had a crucial history in Chamberlain's thinking. He had long held, and had long told, the 1894-95 Royal Commission on the Aged Poor that he would finance the pensions by an import duty on wheat, and that nothing that I have ever said or written would prevent me advocating a tax on corn for a specific purpose. Old age pensions were one of the items of his unfinished business with the Conservatives, but the corn duty struck another chord. Duties on food and raw materials were the precondition of any sort of imperial preference. 4 days before Chamberlain was to speak in the Birmingham Town Hall on the 16th of May 1902, a unanimous resolution in favour of the reciprocal preference had been passed in the Canadian Parliament, in anticipation of the Colonial Conference in June, which would accompany Edward VII's coronation. In his speech, Chamberlain referred with ridicule to Liberals who had attacked the corn tax just because it did create the possibility of preferential relations with our colonies. He then took occasion to conclude, with unmistakable relevance, if by adherence to economic pedantry, to old shibboleths, we are to lose opportunities of closer union which are offered to us by our colonies, if we are to put aside occasions now within our grasp, if we do not take every chance in our power to keep British trade in British hands, I am certain that we shall deserve the disasters which will infallibly come upon us. The coronation was deferred, but the Colonial Conference was not. Chamberlain repeated his proposals for a real council of the empire to which all questions of imperial interest might be referred, and for imperial contributions to defence. To these the conference had returned a stony response. On the contrary, it resolved, while recognising that in the present circumstances of the colonies it is not practicable to adopt a general system of free trade as between the mother country and the British dominions beyond the seas, to urge respectfully on HMG the expediency of granting in the UK preferential treatment to the products and manufactures of the colonies, either by exemption from a reduction of duties now or the hereafter to be imposed. The Prime Ministers, and above all Sir Wilfrid Laurier, left no doubt that their urging was serious. It fell to a new government, in which Balfour had replaced Salisbury and Ritchie had replaced Hick's speech, to resolve whether this was or was not the outcome of their review of the fiscal system. After a cabinet meeting on 19th November 1902, Balfour informed the King that after the long and elaborate discussion, the cabinet finally resolved that, as at present advised, they would maintain the corn tax, but that a preferential remission of it should be made in favour of the British Empire. It was alleged later that the new Chancellor was the only dissentient. But having been defeated at the season when Chancellors were weak, he renewed the battle with success when the Chancellors are strong, on Budget Eve. About the end of February 1903, before Chamberlain was back from South Africa, Ritchie warned the Prime Minister that he would resign unless he allowed to repeal the corn duty, and at cabinets on the 17th and 31st of March, he forced the cabinet to resile from its decision of the previous November, with the sop to Chamberlain of reserving his right to argue for re-imposition when the matter had been further studied in the summer. Accordingly, the budget on 23rd of April removed the duty, and with it the basis for imperial preference. For reasons which are withdrawn from the possibility of our knowledge, Chamberlain had failed to resign, though his personal prestige stood at its height, and his resignation rendered not only intelligible but publicly justifiable by his colleagues' failure to prepare the way for the imperial preference, with all the overtones of imperial unity attaching to that, would have saved him from personal humiliation. He would have been the hero, the martyr of empire. The consequences of his failure to resign were never to be repaired. Thus baffled inside government, he resorted to his ancient weapon of the public speech, and that on his classic stage, the Birmingham Town Hall. As with many speeches which detonate tremendous political explosions, he said nothing in it that he had not said before, and in public. It was the occasion which was the fulminate. After taking his hearers on a review of the roads to imperial unity which were not open, he concluded the offer of preferential duties that the colonies had unanimously made, and with their expectation that in offering Britain preference they would be protected against retaliation such as Germany was already exerting against the Canadians. It was protection that Britain could only afford to the colonies if she was herself in a position to raise retaliatory tariffs against other countries. His conclusion was that Britain must choose between maintaining free trade in absolutely a new situation, or decide to recover our freedom, resume the power of negotiation, and if necessary, retaliation whenever our own interests or our relations between our colonies and ourselves are threatened by other people. I desire, he said, that a discussion on this subject should be opened, and he warned the opposition that at a forthcoming election they would find the issues which they propose to raise are not the issues on which we shall take the opinion of the country. The peroration contained a fatal ambiguity. The Cabinet's decision formally covered Chamberlain's advocacy of a discussion, which he repeated in the House itself the following week in an old age pensions debate by referring to that review of the fiscal systems which I have indicated as necessary and desirable at an early date. But if the government were to take opinion of the country, they could do so only if they themselves had come to a conclusion, and that the conclusion which Chamberlain presumed, namely in favour of the reciprocal and retaliatory tariffs, which presently became known as tariff reform. Moreover, unless the discussion were to be conducted behind closed doors in the cabinet room, which was absurd, it would have to be fought through in the public between the proselytizers and the anti-proselytizers, who could not be prevented from forming two antithetical wings, and soon two opposing camps in the Conservative and Unionist ranks. In a further parliamentary debate on the 28th of May, Balfour sustained Chamberlain's right and duty to open up the question, and he and Chamberlain expressed themselves as unaware of any disagreement with what the other said. So long as the session continued, the respective protagonists in the government contrived, not without embarrassment, to avoid direct personal conflict. In the country, however, particularly inside the Unionist ranks, the campaigns got underway on both sides. Literature was prepared and research organisations created, especially in the tariff reform cause. Once the session ended, it was clear that the conflict inside the cabinet itself must be resolved. On the eve of its meeting on the 14th of September, Chamberlain wrote to the Prime Minister intimating that unless the decision were in favour of preferential as well as retaliatory tariffs, he must leave the government, a course of which would reduce Balfour's difficulties and give Chamberlain the freedom of action he had failed to secure by his resignation in March. Accordingly, when the discussion in Cabinet showed the Prime Minister unwilling to support a preferential tariff as a matter of practical politics, Chamberlain announced that he would resign, albeit continuing thereafter to support the government as a private member. As he had done 17 years before, Chamberlain had once again left a government to take the leadership of a cause which foreseeably would reshape the party system. On this occasion, however, a comedy of errors was enacted which involved the government in humiliating confusion and marred the opportunity that Chamberlain sought. In anticipation of the Cabinet, 4 of its other members, Ritchie, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Balfour of Burghley, Lord George Hamilton, and the Duke of Devonshire, had agreed to re-sign collectively if the Cabinet acceded to the principle of preference. Unaware that Chamberlain was drawing the opposite conclusion, they took his demand to be the upshot of the debate, and all 4 sent in their resignations the following day. Balfour accepted those of the first 3 and appointed Austen Chamberlain to succeed Ritchie, but he induced the Duke to withdraw his resignation by informing him of Chamberlain's and in indicating that in the forthcoming speech at the party conference of Sheffield on the 1st of October, he, Balfour, would come out against preference. He did, in fact, on that occasion, while advocating fiscal reform, declare that he could not propose preference to the country because I believe the country will not tolerate a tax on food. All the same, the Duke, whose conscience had been pricking him, resigned. Balfour's juggling had come to nothing, and the government and the Conservative and Unionist parties, though their rank and file appeared to be favourably disposed to tariff reform, were irretrievably split, with the Prime Minister stranded ignominiously in between. Constituency opinion from then on became increasingly menacing to the future of the government MPs and candidates who opposed tariff reform. It seems clear, wrote Lord Hugh Cecil, who was one of them, to the Duke of Devonshire in December 1903, that except in exceptional circumstances, no free trade unionist is likely to be returned to the next Parliament unless by the help of the opposition. And abortive contacts actually took place between the Duke and leading Liberals. As no realignment, however, such as had occurred after 1886 took place, individuals sought their own salvation by changing parties outright. In April 1904, for example, Winston Churchill was adopted as the Liberal candidate for Manchester Central. The Duke's position at the head of the Liberal Unionist Association became untenable. And when he resigned in May 1904, his place was taken by Chamberlain himself, who set about turning the association into a campaign engine for tariff reform. The week after Balfour's Sheffield speech, Chamberlain delivered at Glasgow the first of a carefully calculated series of 12 speeches in the major cities of Great Britain. They were modulated for variety and to cover different aspects of the case at different lengths. In theory, the campaign was conducted within the Conservative and Unionist ranks, and the respective bigwigs were carefully invited, but in substance Chamberlain was appealing over the parties to the electorate. "I am quite sure that my people, by which I mean not necessarily Liberal Unionists, but my supporters in the country, will not take any slight to me lying down, and the result of such cowardice as some of the Conservatives seem to contemplate will be certain destruction of the government, and a breach with it will take years to heal." The speech's balanced imperial theme, "It is only commercial union, reciprocal preference, that you can lay the foundations of the confederation of the empire to which we all look forward as a brilliant possibility, with the preservation of Britain's export of manufactures. Quote, they, the colonies, will reserve to us the trade which we already enjoy. They will arrange for the tariffs in the future in order not to start industries and competition with those which are already in existence in the mother country." End quote. And the power of retaliation. Quote, "The protected countries which you have been told were going rapidly to rack and ruin have progressed in much greater proportion than ours." End quote. In order to counter the charge that tariffs would raise the cost of living, Chamberlain proposed to offset them with equal reductions of the tariffs on tea and sugar, which where reciprocity was not envisaged, but thereby the revenue which once might have financed old age pensions and other social benefits was eaten up. It was now a frank appeal, consciously designed to outbid that of socialism to the workers. "I trust the working class of this country, and I have confidence that they, who are our masters, electorally speaking, will have the intelligence to see that they must wake up." The manner in which electoral opinion would be tested attracted more and more attention as 1904 wore on, and the popularity of the government continued to ebb. "I wish this country could take tomorrow," said Chamberlain at Birmingham on the 12th of May 1904, "a plebiscite, a vote of the people of this country, as to whether or not they would have the change in our fiscal system which I proposed to you. But since they could not affect the instrument with which we have to work, the tariff reformers must seek to make that issue overshadow all others, even at a British-type general election, by the precision and boldness of their programme. If it does not serve us well this time," he hinted ominously, "we will keep it in reserve for the next." It was not to be the last occasion in British political history when a plebiscite or referendum was glimpsed as the means of averting or healing an unbridgeable party division over a major issue by referring it directly to the electorate and thus securing the verdict to which either side in the argument could defer without loss of face if defeated. For a party in office, however, the device of a referendum raises a painful dilemma. Is the referendum to be held before the Government Act, or is the Government Act subject to validation by a subsequent popular vote? No doubt it was some such reflection which led Balfour to promulgate on the 3rd of October 1904 at Edinburgh a proposal as bizarre as it was disastrous. The Colonial Conference of 1902 had adjourned to 1906. Let the electorate, he proposed, be invited at the next election to give a mandate for the Colonial Conference to meet free of objections in principle on Britain's part to any aspects of protective or reciprocal tariffs. then let whatever was called for by the conference be put to the electorate at a second general election before anything else was enacted by Parliament. Chamberlain affected to regard this as a deeper commitment by Balfour to the preferential principle, but logically he repudiated the necessity for 2 elections and for the British electorate having to wait till at least the rest of empire had spoken. Through the closing months of 1904 and the opening weeks of 1905, he conducted a second great speaking campaign in which 2 new notes were struck. One was the appeal to the farmer and the farm labourer, who now, unlike the days of Cobdenite free trade, has the vote, can make his voice heard, and carry elections in many counties. For them too, like the urban proletariat, protection, for that was increasingly the implication, was advantageous. The watchword, he concluded a speech at Welbeck on the 4th of August, 1904, in the agricultural districts is this: more profit for the farmer, more employment for the labourer, and cheaper food, because of the offsetting reductions, for his family. The other note was heard at Limehouse in December. It was linked control of immigration with protection. You are suffering from unrestricted imports of cheaper goods. You are suffering from the unrestricted immigration of the people who make these goods. He concluded, I have sacrificed the power and influence which office gives in order to be able to put before you this question of fiscal reform, free and untrammelled by any party connection. I say that I have done my duty. It is for you to do yours. What will you do? A voice answered, make you Prime Minister. Cheers resounded. During 1905, the increasing imminence of a general election and the consequent polarisation between free traders and tariff reformers on the government side put almost intolerable pressure on the Prime Minister to declare himself, a declaration which would only favour Chamberlain's cause. Defeat through the break-up of the government's supporters in face of opposition motions on fiscal reform was only agonisingly avoided in March and again in May. On the 2nd of June, at the Albert Hall, Balfour went so far as not only to commit himself to retaliation, but to describe that other great branch of fiscal reform, which stirs and ought to stir a responsive fibre in the heart of every citizen of the empire, as the most urgent of all the great constructive problems with which we have to deal. For a time, even the possibility of Chamberlain rejoining the government before the election was seriously canvassed, but in the end Balfour found it impossible to shake off his Edinburgh commitment to a double election with its implied neutrality or lukewarmness towards tariff reform at the first of the 2 elections, the only real one. After the National Union had passed a Chamberlainite resolution on the 15th of November at its annual conference, and Chamberlain in a series of speeches had hung protectionist declarations round the Prime Minister's neck, the prospects of a further parliamentary session appeared intolerable. On the 4th of December 1905, Balfour resigned, and his successor, Campbell Bannerman, formed a Liberal government and dissolved. At the election of January 1906, the Conservatives and their Unionist allies were annihilated, returning with only 157 members. But the Unionists held all seats in Birmingham, with increased majorities, and no reading of the results could be made to indicate that tariff reform had been a handicap to candidates who espoused it resolutely. In fact, tariff reformers numbered the majority, 102, of the remnant that appeared on the opposition benches. Balfour himself was unseated, and naturally the question of his continued leadership was a live one. While Chamberlain stubbornly maintained that he would not oppose Balfour, both for the sake of long association and loyalty, and also because of a group which was 7/10 Conservative, must be led by a Conservative, he was nevertheless determined, as soon as the new Parliament should meet, to have it decided by as large and representative a body and party assemblage as possible, whether it was to be his full-blooded version of tariff reform or Balfour's equivocation that should prevail as the opposition's policy. At the last moment, Balfour capitulated and in a letter accepted that fiscal reform is and must remain the first constructive work of the Unionist Party, that the objects of such a reform are to secure more equal terms of competition, retaliation, and closer commercial union with the colonies, that's preference, and that the establishment of the moderate general tariff on manufactured goods and the imposition of a small duty on foreign corn should be adopted if shown to be necessary to for the attainment of the ends in view. Chamberlain had imposed his policy once again, more strikingly than in 1886-95, upon the Conservative Party. But this time it was a Conservative Party in ruins. For the first fortnight, until Balfour returned as member for the City of London, Chamberlain led the opposition, and afterwards he remained the most effective operator on its front bench, taking in particular a large part against the Education Bill, later to perish in the Lords, which sought to amend the fatal Act of 1902, by transferring all elementary voluntary schools to the public authorities and excluding denominational instruction in them from school hours. Partly a series of minor illnesses and partly the aftermath of defeat prevented Chamberlain from enlarging by speeches in the country the newly agreed basis for advocacy of tariff reform. But on the 7th and 9th July he celebrated his 70th birthday and his 30th year as Member of Parliament by a banquet in the Birmingham Council House and an enormous meeting in the Bingley Hall which outstripped even Gladstone's. His speech reigned over his political life from the start, through the struggle against Home Rule to the abandonment of free trade and the grimmer environment of the 20th century. Relatively, in proportion to our competitors, we are getting behindhand, and when the tide of prosperity recedes, and at a time of depression follows it, the working classes especially will be the sufferers, and we shall find then that it will be impossible, without a change, to find employment for the constantly increasing population of these islands. The remedy is at hand. We can extend our trade in the best markets, with our best friends. We can benefit them in trading with them, while they give us reciprocal advantage in the preference which they give for our manufactures. In his peroration he returned to the theme of federation. By a commercial union, we can pave the way for that federation which I see constantly before me as a practicable object of aspiration. That federation of free nations which will enable us to prolong in the ages yet to come all the glorious traditions of the British race. The union of the empire must be preceded and accompanied by a better understanding, by a closer sympathy. To secure that is the highest object of statesmanship, now at the beginning of the 20th century. If these were the last words that I were permitted to utter to you, I would rejoice to utter them in your presence and with your approval. 2 days afterwards, Chamberlain suffered a stroke which deprived him of the effective power of locomotion and of public speech for the rest of his life. West Birmingham remained faithful at both of the elections of 1910 and returned him, chivalrously, unopposed. When the Parliament of 1911 met, Arthur Lee helped Austen Chamberlain to carry his father into the chamber, having waited until other members had left. For a few moments, an eyewitness wrote, he sat, piteously but proudly motionless, whilst his eye slowly surveyed the empty benches and galleries, and then he indistinctly repeated the oath after the clerk. To sign the roll was for him a physical impossibility, but Austen guided his hand sufficiently to make a shaky cross, and then after another poignant pause, we carried him out again. As he passed the chair, the speaker leaned over to touch his helpless hand. Only at the beginning of 1914 did Chamberlain announce that he would not seek election again. He died on 2nd of July, the day the papers carried the news from Sarajevo. Epilogue. All political lives, unless they are cut off in midstream at a happy juncture, end in failure, because that is the nature of politics and of human affairs. The career of Joseph Chamberlain was not an exception. 3 times, once as if by anticipation in 1874, again in 1886, and again in 1905, he was the agent of defeat, and even of destruction to the political party in which he lived and worked. Each time the cause for which he was seemed to him so straight, and so overwhelmingly important that he recked not, or even positively desired, that his action should be instrumental in the political triumph of the opposition party. First, the Liberal Party had betrayed radicalism. Then Gladstone had betrayed the United Kingdom. Finally, the Conservative Party had betrayed the empire. His hand should be against betrayal, whatever the consequences. It happened that in the middle walk of life, in his struggle against Home Rule, his feet were planted upon a rock-hard truth. The years accordingly had proved him right there, though not in the form that he intended. It was the truth that a self-governing Ireland could not remain part of the United Kingdom, unless the United Kingdom itself were transformed or dissolved into a federation. The axiom ensured the defeat of Home Rule in 1886 and in 1893, and was to ensure the partition of the United Kingdom and the creation of an independent Irish state in 1922. It rested upon the nature of parliamentary representation. Unless the United Kingdom became a federation, Ireland could not be both self-governed and represented in the United Kingdom Parliament. The sentence of death, which he himself was thus pronouncing upon the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, was beyond Chamberlain's power to contemplate. He took refuge from it, once the Unionist majority of 1895 had placed the Irish question in suspense, in the pursuit of an imperial federation, in which the federation of the United Kingdom might become conceivable. In doing so, borne up by the imperial fervour of the 10 years on either side of 1900, he placed himself in conflict with his own axiom and foredoomed his handiwork to frustration and failure. The self-governing colonies could not be represented either in the UK Parliament or in any common parliament for the same reason, essentially, as a self-governing Ireland could not. Namely, that whether they knew it or not, they were, by necessity of circumstances, nations in their own right. Even in its attenuated form of a customs union or a preferential trading bloc, a federation is a nation, a sovereign political unit, or it is nothing. The federal ideal, to which Chamberlain devoted the last 10 years of his active life, and to which he sacrificed the Unionist Party, as he had sacrificed the Liberal Party before, was indeed nothing. His labour was in vain, and the years have condemned it. The pathos of Chamberlain's political life was not the less for his having never clearly perceived that he had turned down his own weapons against himself. It was the pathos of an Ajax, not an Achilles.